this guy off. Start all. Why am I not seeing it? Here we are. Hi, I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher, coming to you from my ITV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Information philosophy is the first new method of philosophizing since logical positivism and analytical language philosophy that started in the early 20th century, but has largely been a failure as regards solving any of the great problems in philosophy. Now, information philosophy is called a systematic philosophy because it has methods applicable to the fundamental questions about the nature of the universe and our place in it, so it gets to be very deep as compared to language philosophy, which had a much narrower focus. In many ways, information philosophy is radically different from the philosophy taught in our universities today. Academic philosophers generally were trained as analytic language philosophers whose job was to basically analyze concepts and make them clear, and they argued that if you thought clearly and defined your terms carefully, you'd be able to solve great problems in philosophy. That did not turn out to be the case. Mostly they joked about it or described it as dissolving problems rather than solving them. That is to say, show that the problems were somehow caused by confusing usage of different ideas. Now, information is important, because it needs matter to be embodied, and it needs energy to be communicated, like this lecture coming to you over the internet. But matter and energy are conserved quantities. It may be hard to believe, but the total amount of matter and energy in the universe today is just exactly the same as we had 14 billion years ago at the beginning of the universe. But if we can't change the amount of matter and energy in the universe, then what can possibly explain the evolutionary change that we see all around us? I'll show that all changes are in the arrangement of the matter that we have, the arrangement of the atoms and molecules into what I call information structures, like the galaxies, the stars, and the planets that formed billions of years ago. And stars and galaxies are passive objects under the complete control of physical forces or laws like gravity, electromagnetism, and nuclear forces. Whereas living things, you and I, are dynamic and growing information structures under the control of the information processing, the computational, some think of it, algorithms working in our brains that have evolved naturally and are allowing us to exercise control over the matter and energy. I'll show that we are forms through which matter and energy continuously flow. And the information in us, for example, the DNA in our cells, all the way to the thinking in our minds, is the controlling process. The information processing is controlling those flows of matter and energy. So let me take us to our lecture today, which I can show you should be on free will. I've got my big scanner showing where I have my Surface Pros and my main computer and various controlling systems and my keyboard. Let me just zoom in on today's book. And I've taken, I'm moving us to a new area of the free will problem. In the past, we've been talking about how free will, is compromised, some think, by determinism coming up from below, the materialist, reductionist thinkers, so-called eliminative materialists, because they think they eliminate anything but that which is caused by the physical world, the world of matter, and the interactions between matter are arguably always causing everything going upward from physics. Chemistry reduces to physics, and that's correct. Nothing that happens in physics in chemistry cannot be explained by physics, more or less. And so it goes. We hear the argument moving upward, so-called bottom-up causation, that physics determines chemistry, chemistry determines biology. Biology then, by understanding, for example, the brain, would determine our thinking. And that's usually described as mind being an epiphenomenon, something beyond the material world, and therefore to those who think that's all metaphysical nonsense, there is no mind. Mind is an illusion, consciousness is illusion, free will is an illusion, and so forth. So my attempt with information philosophy is to get past some of these arguments, which are out there taught throughout all our colleges, universities. The textbooks on issues like free will and determinism tend to lean towards accepting the determinism because it's thought to be based on science, scientifically based determinism. How can a philosopher argue against that? Well, I'm hoping we will provide some tools for them to argue against that, because teaching that we are determined and not having a kind of degree of freedom, an ability to be creative and create new things in the world is, to me, a scandal, pure and simple. Come back to my look right here. This is why I subtitled my book, The Scandal in Philosophy. Okay, so what I've chosen for our topic today is to look at that one intermediate level at biology, because I am going to admit that things that happen in chemistry are completely consistent with the laws of physics. Now, that's not to say that chemistry is, quote, determined, and that everything that happens in chemistry can be traced back through a causal chain of event causing next event, and a chain of events which goes back all the way to the beginning of the universe, the so-called prime mover who set everything in motion, and now everything since has been just lawful, causal, determined things happening. That's not true in physics, and that's not true in chemistry. But there are those who think that, well, biology is a big system. Maybe everything in biology is determined, perhaps by the things coming up from below or internally. So the question becomes, in what sense, if any, are biological organisms, all of us, right from the very first living things up to ourselves, are we determined for any? What can we say about that? And what I'm going to try to say, here I have my blog page up. The I-Phi blog is now where I put up all my individual lectures. So if I scroll backwards here, we would find the great problems that we did yesterday. I've also added a little, and there's a link to the talk. And here I have a note. Over the weekend, I finally got some time to get back to writing. I've been putting a lot of time in to the running of this studio, the ITV studio. Yesterday I had a big problem with a feedback coming of my voice, and it produced a terrible echo in the lecture. But this is still early days of me learning how to be a webcasting philosopher, trying to talk to people anywhere in the world who are interested in the deepest questions of philosophy and the sciences, physics, biology today, and psychology, how it is we argue about what's going on in our minds, what's the status of consciousness as far as information processing in the brain is concerned, and so forth. So, as I say, yes, over the weekend, I got to rewrite Chapter 8 of my book, Albert Einstein. I call it, My God, He Plays Dice, because famously Einstein always said, God does not play dice, which was his position that the universe needed to have rational reasons underlying everything's happening. It seemed to him that Newtonian laws, and then his gravitational relativity laws. All of them seem to point toward a very well-organized, well-running universe, and it probably had its rules, and the rules were probably always followed. But probably is the word, because if things happen only statistically, if there is at some level in the world a kind of chance working, indeterminism working, that bothered Einstein. But as I pointed out, and on chapter 15 at the moment, in these early chapters, I think I've shown that Einstein was the discoverer of indeterminism. That is to say, he discovered chance, ontological, deep chance, not epistemological as we discussed yesterday, not how do we know whether there's chance and what it means to know that there's chance, but that there is chance. Ontologically, at the deep metaphysical level, ontological level, there is chance. Einstein was the one who discovered it in 1916, published in 1617, a couple of papers, and he never liked it. But I'm going to show that, like many other concepts in quantum physics, it was Einstein who saw them first. And that puts him in an interesting place, because the founders of quantum mechanics in the late 20s argue that he's become senile and really may not know what's going on, and they don't give him much credit, and I'm hoping to restore that credit that he deserves for understanding what's going on in physics, and therefore in chemistry, and therefore in biology. Now, what I thought I would do, I did a blog post here that was not a lecture. It was just me talking to you about working on my book, which I hope some of you may be interested in. Maybe some of you will be interested in my other books, my metaphysics book, my Great Problems book. In fact, the Great Problems book today brings us something important to this topic about biological organisms, because in the Great Problems book, I believe I can find somewhere a chapter on the origin of life. Let me go back to this view here for a moment as we explore. Origins, the origin of life, the origins of life and information. Let's go in a little tighter. And as I turn these pages, I guess I need a little bit farther back, you'll see somewhere along I have a section called Information in Biology. And information in biology is very interesting because it may contribute an aspect of information that there's new information being created. I mean, it's obvious, totally obvious, that biology has been increasing the amount of information in the universe since it's the first living things a few billion years ago, and this book is testimony to that. And yet many people didn't think information thinking was important in biology. So I turn a page here and I have a section on biological machines, which I'd like to talk to you about today. Look at how these machines work and see if we can see whether they are just totally determined. They certainly are absolutely wonderful machines. So I have some diagrams. I've chosen 5 different machines to illustrate. There's quite a beautiful one here called an ion pump. This one is a diagram of how the ribosome creates proteins. Then we have one called the flagellum, which is an incredible motor, a very high-speed motor, this part rotating thousands of times per second, like our most powerful or rapid motors. And then something called an ion pump. And in the print book, I'll only show you step by step, but I hope I'll be able to give you an animated version of that going forward. That's my goal. And then I have this wonderful thing called the chaperone, which we'll talk about more. When a protein comes out of the ribosome, it may not fold properly. And if it doesn't fold properly, this chaperone pulls the non-folding protein inside itself, puts a cap on itself like a little trash can, and the bad protein that isn't turning into an enzyme, it's not getting its normal activity, gets squeezed and then whoop, it looks a little nicer here, like an ampersand, and it's let go. And now we've had these chaperones assisting the activation of proteins so that they perform their functions in biology. Okay, so that's the way my Great Problems book discusses biology, and I hope you'll look at that. Remember, you don't have to look at you don't have to buy a copy of this book, because the whole thing and all my books are on the web as PDFs that you can download, read on the screen, or print out so you have your own copies. Or if you're a professor teaching these subjects in philosophy that I might add something to, add value to your own lectures, I hope you will download these, and suggest the students just download them and print them out so they don't have to buy a book. And of course, they can just use the website. Let me take a moment right here and talk to you about the website. In the last several days, I've had letters from people asking whether they can help with my work here, because I'm trying to juggle a lot of balls. Let me just bring this up on the... I think I don't have that exactly. So, yeah, here it is, how you can help. I do have it up there. And I can back out by looking at this one. Here we go. That's a full screen. So it starts off with my new opening line that I believe this is a new method of philosophizing, and so you can help by understanding the methods. And I thought the first thing I would say to you is, if you would like to help my work with what I call information philosophy, because it's not language philosophy or analytic philosophy of the normal kind taught today, and it's not logical philosophy, although it does use logic. I attempt to be a logical thinker and use reason in order to draw conclusions and to make predictions in science and so forth. And I'm also a language philosopher, in the sense that I'm very interested in the usage of language. You'll see I'm rather critical of academic philosophers today who pride themselves on being careful analysts of the concepts and their definitions. The attack on mind that happened in the middle of the 20th century, the book was titled Concept of Mind, The Concept of Mind, by Gilbert Ryle. Ryle was a mentor to Dan Dennett, who argues today that this idea of a mind and a libertarian free will are all illusions, came from Gilbert Ryle's initial criticism of how it is we were arguing about this thing called a mind. And I see in their work a great deal of confusion in the definitions that they think are going to clarify and eliminate these problems. They for example, confuse free with will, where in my two-stage model since William James, the free part is our ability to generate new possibilities that have never been thought of before. Which gives us a choice between things, some of which are new, as long as some of them are new, never existed before. Then you have a case of free will, and you have the ability for humans to be creative. This is all extremely important. Without it, I think it's a scandal the way they're teaching. So, for example, then Dennett's position today is to identify free will with moral responsibility, moral actions. So we discussed some of that last week, and it's excellent to say that people are morally responsible and analyze moral responsibility, but I think that's an issue for each individual society or culture to look into what constitutes the good and the bad in the form of actions and behaviors. And of course, behind the moral evaluations come the legal evaluations. Sadly, much of the claim that free will is compatible with determinism, that determinism is the normal way everything's happening, this has a deleterious effect. Even in the courts, people are arguing we should mitigate punishment. We should not think of these things as happenings by or actions by free and responsible people. Now, Dennett isn't in that position, but most compatibilists, and many compatibilists, lean to the side of hard determinism. Determinism is the case, and as a result, we are not the ones that should be held responsible for our actions. That's not my debate, except I discuss it a great deal, and I also write about many people who have maintained this view over the years, and they're very influential thinkers. Down the left-hand side of my screen, you'll find a very large number of thinkers who are basically compatibilist. Okay, so what I wanted to say with those who think they might be interested in helping is they could just start to think of themselves as doing information philosophy, looking at problems. Many of you have not really studied philosophy deeply, but what I'd like you to do is, if you do think of a problem in philosophy and what is being taught, try to think about it in terms of what's going on in terms of information processing. These are programs that are running in our minds, and the question is, do they run on their own and we have nothing to do with it? Or does thinking about what we do, thinking about our thinking, and realizing that we take in new information, it goes into our minds, gets recorded, and then we may or may not act on all of that, does that give you a deeper appreciation or maybe an understanding of why it is there is an ability for you and me to think up new things? And that's an element of our freedom. Creativity is just another way of talking about free will, free agency, and so forth. Okay, so if you think about yourself, what I'm arguing here, as a philosopher, as an information philosopher, that would help. You could just say, I'm not a language philosopher, I'm an information philosopher. And if enough of you say that, that would help draw attention to our work and get a lot of other people in the project with us. And one thing I just wanted to point out, that some people may think that that any philosophy that like mine might be an attack on their own belief systems. And I've had quite a few emails from people who say they already know the answers to many of the questions I'm raising in my work. You know, thank you very much, Bob, but I have been told I have the word of God or I have the word of authority through the ages, and it's a different position from the one I'm coming to. I do not mean, as I want to say, to be trying to change anybody's beliefs. What my goal is to tell you, to my best of my ability, to teach you what's going on in the world, from cosmological origins down to our biological origins, and give you the best knowledge we have today of how the world is working. And then it's up to you to decide whether that fits into what your parents or your grandparents or your culture may have taught you, or your professors who are very likely themselves kind of holding a vested interest because all of their colleagues pat one another on their backs and maintain they've got the best thing they think they should be teaching to you. I'm a little skeptical about my academic colleagues. But then I have one possibility that you could help with that's a really large task, and if it has thousands of things that need to be done, and if people did just a small handful, they'd all get done. And what that is the fact that my web pages are very successful on the web at the moment, but they would be more likely to be looked at if we had more incoming links, basically. Go to this screen for just a moment. Here we are again with the How You Can Help page. And what I wanted to do is show you something which I just happened on. Suppose I click here, create a new page, and just type in free will. This may not come out exactly the same as I did a few moments ago, but what we get is a reference to the Wikipedia, a reference to Internet Encyclopedia, a reference to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is wonderful. And look what's here. Oh my goodness. Here we are on the home page, what's called the first results page of the, let's see, I need to bring that over here for a moment so it's behind me. Here we are on the first results page from a Google search on the term free will. And lo and behold, there's the Internet Wikipedia, there's an Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and an article in the Atlantic magazine, and then a book by Sam Harris, which is just totally opposed to the idea of freedom, free will, as if it's an illusion. And here I am with my information philosopher. Now, I'm very happy about that, and that's because the web homepage has many, many thousands of incoming links that point to this page. But that's not the case for all the pages, because, let's see, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to then just scroll to the left for a moment. And all of these names of philosophers and scientists, they could use more incoming links. And the best way to do that is to go to the Wikipedia. So let me just come over here for a moment. And what you could do is go to the Wikipedia and look up a page that interests you, and any one of these thinkers that I've done, or any of the drop-down menus of problems and whatever. Here we are under, say, mind, and you could say, whoops, there I went to the mind page. I think I want to go back away from that, but you could go to Wikipedia, find a page that has the same title, search for it, and then go down to the bottom of the page and see if it says something like Mind on Information Philosopher, or on my metaphysicist, which would be great. But and if not, you might decide that my page is important enough for you to add a link onto Wikipedia that says, see Mind Body on Information Philosopher, or see William James or Gilbert Ryle on Information Philosopher. Now, you could say, why am I not doing it myself? Well, partly it's a huge job. I would greatly appreciate help. But the other thing is that the policy of Wikipedia is for people like me not to write about my own work. And that kind of work is unaccepted. And so following their policy, I don't put links to my work on their website. But other people are doing it. And if any of you said you have some time, you'd like to go do a little bit of work, you could just add a link on Wikipedia, which is very supportive of Winks, point into some of these pages here. All of these thinkers that I've written about, or all of the problems that I've written about. Okay, let's get back to our molecular machines discussion today. And what I've done is, let me read you a little bit of this, because this is the introduction. This is on the page called Information Philosophy, and the introduction page. Let me go back to that for just a moment. Show you that where I am now is under the introduction, and then down here to the biology link. And when I examine information in biology, I've been working on this for many years. Go here again. Information in, oh, I'm back to molecular machines, so I need to do this. Information in biology is a very, very large subject. I've studied half a dozen conferences, the earliest in the 1920s, which were already talking about the notion of information. It wasn't yet turned into computer information, digital information, the kind of data we quantify in bits and bytes. But people were asking, what's the relationship between information and biology? There were some famous conferences in New York called the Macy conferences, just after the years when Claude Shannon quantified and mathematized and made information into a deep subject in both math thermodynamics connection and communications, engineering and so forth. Suddenly people were asking, do biological systems involve information? And there were those who didn't think so. They thought it inappropriate, and a few others who argued that it was important. I have written about all of them in my information and biology page. I mentioned several of them, and the earliest ones. One very, very interesting one. Let me just scroll down while I'm talking about this, information in biology, and see if I put it here. Origin of life. Not really. I've come to my molecular machines, so we'll come back to that. In my book on great problems, I mentioned the first person to strongly argue for information in biology was female. And I'm always pleased to find contributions by great women scientists. In this case, let me go back to my overhead screen here for a moment. Let me also then zoom in so I can get tight enough to find this woman on page 314. The first person to articulate the information processing aspect of life was Leela Gatlin, who wrote in 1971, "Life may be defined operationally as an information processing system, a structural hierarchy of functioning units that is acquired through evolution the ability to store and process the information necessary for its own accurate reproduction." The key word in the definition is information. So I was very pleased to find that work, and I found several others who have started arguing in this direction that information plays a role. Once the structure of DNA was elaborated by Watson and Crick, it became clear that DNA was a code, and it had in it the kind of programming capability by which DNA could duplicate, replicate our cells. Our cells would have the same DNA in them as they replicate, but the cells could perform different functions, and the DNA was in charge of creating the components of cells down in the nucleus where the DNA is, and the mitochondria, which kind of the power factories, and other organelles and elements inside the cell wall itself. All of it has to be built, and Leela Gatlin was the first to say this looks to her like an information processing system. Today, I'd like to say it looks even more, these particular components, they look even more like molecular machines. They're actually, as we study them more and more closely under electron microscopes and much more high-resolution ways of studying these cells, we find that they look a lot like machines. And that's what I'd like to introduce you to today. You'll find it in the book on great problems, in the download under biology, under my introduction, and here on this page, molecular machines. So we're going to come back here, and I'll try to talk you through a couple of these paragraphs. Biological communications. Let's see, I'll just enlarge the page as much as possible. Biological communications, the information exchanged in messages between biological entities, is far more important than the particular physical and chemical entities themselves. These material entities, the molecules that come in our food and the energy that comes in our food, the material is used up and replaced many times in the life cycle of a whole organism. While this messaging, the information in the messages and in the structures, has remained constant, not just over the life of an individual, but that of a whole species, and perhaps even all the way back, in the sense that the very earliest DNA cells, before them there were something smaller, RNA, and then even smaller things perhaps, but The DNA in our body, in our cells, contains sections of code that are just the same, as far as we could tell, that were there 3 billion years ago, because it is a section of the DNA that's shared by all living things. And that's quite astonishing. In fact, it almost seems on the face of it, that's total proof that information is a key way to think about what's going on in our biology and explanatory of all of biology. So, and that's the point I make in my introduction quite often, that we are forms. We are, as a whole, best thought of as information. Now you could say, well, we're nothing without our body, and I agree, and we can't get by without energy. So we are matter and energy, but the matter and energy is flowing through us. So I'm 81, and arguably the cells, the molecules making up the cells have probably changed 8 times or more, 8 or 9 times since I was a boy. We are not that matter. The matter is important, but it flows on through us. We are the information structures that have been built out of that matter. Our brains are encoding information in the form of knowing things, our ideas, our language. All those are, in my information philosophy, grounded in the fact that they are information. And that's why information is such a strong tool to try to think about how everything works. So we are not our matter and energy, we are our information. So in fact, most messages, while we're thinking about messaging in biology, and the very specific molecules that embody and encode those messages have been only very slowly varying for billions of years. In other words, molecular communications between things which I'll show are machines are pretty stable over the not just centuries, not just millennia, but billions of years of constancy. So as a result, these sentences or statements or propositions in a biological language, and there I'm adopting the terminology of analytic philosophy, that we can think of these ideas in terms of sentences, ways of talking about biology. These may have a very limited vocabulary compared to human languages. Although I note that the number of words we add to our human languages in a typical human lifetime is remarkably small. Only thousands of new words, whereas well, that's another question, but it turns out languages evolve rather quickly. On the other hand, biological language, if there is such a thing, evolves rather slowly. So I say biological information is far more important than matter and energy, and so forth. And in the next paragraph, far from the materialist idea that these fundamental physical elements, the matter in our body, have causal control over living things, I will show that the biological information processing systems are machines. You can think of them as intelligent robotic machines, artificial intelligence, or real intelligence, that are assembling themselves and building their own replacements when they fail. And that's the case. Our molecules, our cells die at an extraordinary rate. And then they build their own replacements by using the flow of free energy and material with negative entropy to manipulate their finest parts. So let's go on past Wittgenstein and his comments on language. And I say that for the most complex of these biological machines are shown to be composed of dozens of smaller and simpler parts that did in earlier or lower life forms do certain tasks, and they still do the same ones. So I've chosen 5 biological machines, all right? Let me come back here for a moment. Got the first one on the screen. And if I come back to my Origin of Life chapter one more time, I've shown you these 5 machines. The first one is the ribosome. And I will go ahead and just play this couple minutes of the ribosome doing its work, making a new protein, a new polypeptide chain. Let's see what this looks like. Okay, I've got closed captions on. I'll open this window, try to make it take full screen, and see what we can see. Well, it didn't work. That's too bad. I should be able to just click this window, I would think, open it to full screen.
Select the correct amino acids that are specified by the messenger RNA. An aminoacyl tRNA bound to elongation factor TU, EFTU for short, enters the free A site on the ribosome.
I've got to widen
If the anticodon of the charged tRNA does not match the codon in the messenger RNA,
this is better.
The tRNA is rejected. The process of trial and error repeats until the correct tRNA is identified.
Notice the random
Elongation factor TU hydrolyzes its bound GTP and dissociates. If the tRNA is correctly matched and remains bound for a long enough time, it is committed to be used in protein synthesis. The ribosome catalyzes the formation of the new peptide bond and undergoes a dramatic conformational change. Elongation factor G binds to the ribosome. Hydrolysis of GTP by elongation factor G switches the ribosome back to the state in which it can accept the next incoming.
Okay, that one may be a little jargony compared to the one I have in my book, which is just a single still frame from another diagram that I found. But what she's just saying is that here comes a messenger RNA, which came out of the nucleus, the DNA, and these messages are formed up of three little letter codes from the AGCT of DNA, and three letters, in this case AAG, code for a specific one of the 20 possible amino acids. So already we see that there's some programs here. There is some data, and the data is picking out one of the 20 amino acids to add it to the growing polypeptide chain, which will become a protein or an enzyme if it folds correctly. So once again, she just mentioned that one comes in and it contains a code on the bottom of it which does not match the three-letter code needed to add this amino acid onto the end of this growing polypeptide chain. Now there are 20 different amino acids, and they're traveling around at random, flying around inside the cell, and there's a good deal of randomness whether or not the right one will show up. And that's one of the interesting aspects of biology, that it involves a great deal of randomness, and yet it's overall a very powerful deterministic process. So let's go back out to this screen, see if I can find my way back where I was. It's interesting. I thought I had another one. Anyway, this one may look like a not as much like a machine as the next one I'm going to show you. Let me take us over to this screen and full screen it. This is a little machine that creates a thing called ATP. These include small amounts of energy, which then travels around the body, taking energy wherever it's needed to provide support the actions of all the other machines. But this is the machine that makes the packet of energy in the form of ATP. Adenosine triphosphate is a technical name for this thing, much related to the A nucleotide in AGCT that's in the DNA code. But this is part of a little engine that creates little pockets of energy. So let's see this, see if I can do a better job of getting this one going. Let me click here, turn on closed captions. open this one and bring it full screen to you.
Concentration gradients are a key component of the biological world. The potential energy from these gradients is often used to perform biological work. Here we will focus on hydrogen ion concentration gradients. Hydrogen ions are also known as protons. A gradient exists when there is a higher concentration of a molecule in one compartment compared to a neighboring compartment. This animation will demonstrate how the potential energy that results from a hydrogen ion gradient uses ADP and inorganic phosphate, also known as PI, to synthesize ATP. This process involves an enzyme complex called ATP synthase. Gradients and the potential energy they create are key aspects of the biological world. A good example of the use of a gradient occurs in the mitochondria when ATP is synthesized. ATP is synthesized by ATP synthase, a large complex of membrane-bound protein. Here we see ATP synthase, along with other membrane-bound proteins. Notice the large difference in the number of hydrogen ions on the two sides of the membrane. This difference is a hydrogen ion or proton concentration gradient. The energy associated with this gradient is used to synthesize ATP from ADP and PI. This occurs at the ATP synthase complex. One hydrogen ion enters the ATP synthase complex from the intermembrane space, and a second hydrogen ion leaves it on the matrix space. The upper part of the ATP synthase complex rotates when a new hydrogen ion enters. Once 3 protons have entered the matrix space, there is enough energy in the ATP synthase complex to synthesize 1 ATP. In this way, the energy in the hydrogen ion gradient is used to make ATP. Now let's watch the process again. Notice how the proton enters the ATP synthase and exits into the matrix space. Once 3 more hydrogen ions have crossed the membrane, another molecule of ATP will be made. In this example, the hydrogen ion gradient is large enough to produce 6 ATP molecules. Please watch.
Okay, again, some things rather technical for those of you who are not familiar with the incredible advances and what we understand about what's going on down in the tiny little cell wall or the intracellular wall of the mitochondria. The important thing to see here is we're talking about one hydrogen ion, that is to say the nucleus of the hydrogen atom, the proton. This is the smallest object that we need to concern ourselves with in life. Although the electron is another 2,000 times smaller to make up the atom, the nucleus is the large part of hydrogen. And it is being managed at the level of one atom or one ion at a time by this machine. Now, when you think about all the atoms that are in my body, we're talking quadrillions or quintillions and enormous numbers. They have to be built one proton at a time so as to add on an extra phosphate. It was explained that adenosine diphosphate only has 2 phosphate, what do we call them, parts of the chain there, phosphate group. We need a third one to travel around the world and give up its energy, travel around the body and give up its energy. So in order to do that, this little machine has to pull a proton through from the outer level of the wall, outside the cell wall or the mitochondrial wall, bring it in and do this piece of work. Now, it does this by spinning this machinery, which looks a little bit like a handle to turn it here, and then it turns under here, thousands of times a second. And there are trillions of these little machines, the synthesizer of our energy units, called ATP, They are running at thousands of times a second, and there are enormous numbers of them throughout every cell in our body in the mitochondrial parts of the cell, cranking away constantly at speeds that look like a jet engine. And to me, first of all, it looks like a machine. And the question is it deterministic? Is it doing it flawlessly? Are there never any mistakes? Well, in the case of ribosomes, we'll be able to show you they often make mistakes, and that the proteins that come out are not perfect and need some help in order to fold and become enzymes. Let me go back now, try to work through, if I can, a couple more of these machines. This is the little flagellum, the little tail on the bottom of a lot of bacteria, motile bacteria, moving bacteria like the E. coli in our guts, but look at what drives, what this little tail does.
Many species of bacteria propel themselves through their environment by spinning helical motorized flagella. Rhodobacter cells have one flagellum each, whereas E. coli cells have multiple flagella that rotate in bundles. Each flagellum consists of a helical filament that is 20 nanometers wide and up to 15 microns long, and spins on the order of 100 times per second. These animations show a series of schematized and speculative models about how bacterial flagella might function and assemble. Just outside of the cell wall, the filament is connected to a flexible rotating hook. The filament, the hook, and a structure called the basal body, located below the cell's surface, make up the three parts of the flagellum. The basal body consists of a rod and a series of rings embedded in the inner membrane, the peptidoglycan layer, and the outer membrane. Some of the rings make up the flagellar motor, which can be divided into two major parts: the stator, which is attached to the peptidoglycan layer, and as its name implies, remains stationary, and the rotor, which rotates. The motor derives its power from a proton gradient across the membrane. In this example, a high concentration of protons exists outside, and a low concentration exists inside the cell. The protons flow through the interface between two types of proteins, called mote A and mote B, that make up the stator. Mutational studies suggest that a conserved aspartic acid in mote B functions in proton conductance. Each stator.
Let me take it back just a little bit to here and to come out here and talk to you a little bit about this. That proton flow she described from outer edge through and into the lower inner part here of the bacterium is much like the protons that we saw going through the ATP synthase. We are talking about things that are happening with the smallest atoms, parts of atoms. The hydrogen ion is a proton, so it's not even a whole atom that's involved. The atom's been broken apart, ionized, and part of it is being used to drive this motor. The protons coming through are causing the spinning to happen. Once again, this spinning is going on at the speed of a jet engine in every one of our little bacteria. And if you've been following the news in recent months or years, it turns out that we have more bacterial cells in what's now called our biome, living all over the surface of our body, and then down inside from our mouth all the way to the other end, huge numbers, many trillions of bacteria who are sympathetic. They are synergistic, it's called. They are working to support our lives by treating the surfaces of our, what shall I say, system of digestion, by keeping food moving through and doing the right things with it and so forth, digesting it. And these machines, and I think if you look at it with me, you'll agree, this looks like the stator, it's called, and the rotor of a jet engine. And it's going at the speed that our jet engines go when they fly us up into the air. It's amazing that biology has sort of anticipated things that just in the last 100, 200 years, our engineers have realized they could build out of large things and bring this same sort of thing into working for us in other ways. And of course, it's still a sort of metaphor to call this an engine or a motor like or a machine like a jet engine, but the parallel is amazing. It's so amazing that I just want to point out this particular motor machine, molecular machine, biological machine, is considered a poster child to disprove biological evolution. Instead, those who argue it's so complex, and it has some 45 separate little parts, these rings she described and so forth. All of these parts, the argument goes, clearly we need an intelligent designer for this complex a machine, just like we needed one for the jet engine. It has too many parts to imagine them coming together by accident, so that one thinks, how could all the little individual molecules get to do the job to become these components? As I say, some 40 or to 50 recognizable parts of this thing. And how could it all come together by accident? Surely it doesn't. Michael B.E.H.E. is the leading proponent of complex molecular machines like this being proof against Darwinian evolution. But other molecular biologists have, again, in just very recent times, shown that every one of these, well, they've shown about 60% of these 45 components, all are used in simpler biological living things to perform some other task. They're used for something else. And it's well known that biology is a conservative process of change, and it frequently just reuses things that already existed in simpler forms and slowly puts them together. It's a lot easier to put together 45 components which were lying around, so to speak, for the new species or the new cellular system to put to use. Okay? So I'd like to look at more of these, but maybe we'll do some of this next time because we have a wonderful pumping system and a bunch of interesting lectures. But I'll have to slow down here because we're running up against the end of our time. Let's see if I have got my music working. It does seem so in the background. I don't really hear this very well. One of the technical problems of building my studio is I don't have a sound engineer. I can't actually hear the music. I hope you can hear it. I can see that it's playing on one of my screens. And I'd just like to say goodbye for now, for Tuesday. Tomorrow we'll come back to our discussion, lecturing on philosophers and scientists. I'll pick one of them and be happy to have you with us if you can get back at that time. Also, I'd like to remind you that you can contact me if you have questions. I get lots of questions that are basically asking me to tell them what I think about problems they're interested in, and I try to answer those. But I'm much more interested in people who might write, who want to learn something from the materials that I've assembled on the website. So I encourage you to go to my website to look at all of these philosophers and scientists that I've written about for you, often giving you their papers and give you enough information to study on your own what I've been doing for 60 years, really, 20 years with the website. Okay, and I think that's probably all I can say, except I'll remind you that I now have a new link on this page called Want to Help, and if you would go there and help me, I would also appreciate that. Okay, thank you all. Goodbye. Let's see, I need this one on. I should be SK1.